Once upon a time, according to the book of Ruth, when the judges ruled Israel, there was a woman named Naomi. She was married to a man named Elimelech. Elimelech's name means Melech is God, which suggests that this story is an old one, maybe even predates before Israel became Israel, before the Hebrews and their religion came to Palestine. Anyways, Naomi and Elimelech had two sons, and they actually lived a good life in their hometown of Bethlehem. But then hard times came. The rains did not come, the crops withered and died, and famine swept the land. And in desperation, Naomi and Elimelech made a decision. They were going to head east. They're going to go to the fertile plains of Moab, where food could be found. And that was not an easy decision. In fact, it was a very painful decision because in Moab, their God was not worshipped. In Moab, they would be refugees without any land, without any legal rights, without any status, just like for many people today. But that was better than starving. And so they packed up, said goodbye to their home, to their family, and they set out. And Naomi and Elimelech settled in Moab, and they actually built a life for themselves there. And then Elimelech died, left Naomi to grieve with her two sons. But as time passed, the sons grew into men, and even though racial intermarriage was frowned upon in Israel, out of necessity, these two sons married two young women from Moab, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And life went on reasonably well for Naomi and her two sons, and now two daughters-in-law, for about 10 years. And then tragedy struck again. Both of the men in the family, both of the sons, died. We're not told how. We don't know if it was through disease or it was warfare, but they died at the same time, leaving their widows and mother to fend for themselves. And so we have three women, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, now finding themselves in a very desperate situation. It was a society, it was a time in which women were totally dependent on men for economic survival. And so these women were not only left bereft of loved ones, but also without any means of providing for themselves. The two younger women, probably in their late 20s by this time, have little to offer to prospective husbands. But the plight of Naomi is even worse. At a time in life when Naomi might have been watching her grandchildren grow, she is suddenly one of the most helpless persons in society. She is an aging widow. She has no means of support, and she has no immediate children, as in flesh and blood children, sons, to care for her in her old age. But Naomi remembers. She remembers that by the law of the Hebrews, farmers were required to leave part of their harvest in the field, the gleanings, so that destitute individuals, destitute widows like herself, could gather these gleanings for food. And Israel, at least, she thinks, I'm not going to starve. And so besides having lost her husband and two sons, she sees no reason to stay in Moab any longer. So Naomi decides to head back home. And so she packs her things, she heads off on the journey westward, and her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, travel with her down the road. And as the three grieving women travel along, Naomi thinks about the fact that if Orpah and Ruth come with her, well, Naomi will be going back to her homeland, Orpah and Ruth will have nothing, no land, no status. And so she stops in the road. This is from the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And she says to them, both of you have been good daughters-in-law. But now I release you from all and any obligation that you may feel toward me. I want you to turn around and I want you to go back to your original families. And the two younger women who have come to love Naomi in these 10 years begin to cry. And as they cling to her, Naomi says sternly, you are still relatively young. You can marry again and have children. But if you come with me, no husbands, not for you, because your Moabite women will be in Israel. You'll just become what I am, Naomi says. You'll become an impoverished old woman living alone. And so you need to stay here. And Orpah hears the wisdom in Naomi's words, and she accepts her reasoning, and she, with sadness, kisses Naomi and leaves and heads back home. But Ruth stays with Naomi. Ruth refuses to abandon her. And over Naomi's protests, Ruth speaks these beautiful words which are familiar to so many. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Don't press on me to leave you, turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, where your lodging is, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And if you read the verse right after these words, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Now, that's not the end of the story, if only, right? And they lived happily ever after? No, it's not. The story goes on, and through a series of adventures, Naomi is ultimately restored to security, respectability, and Ruth ends up married to a kind and wealthy gentleman by whom she has a son, and it ends up that that son will be actually the grandfather of the greatest king of Israel, David. And so it's a beautiful story. It's a rich story. It's a story like so many biblical stories. What's fascinating about this story is that it can be understood from several different angles. Some readers of the Bible have noted that this story, that the women have a remarkable role in this story. In this book of the Bible, which is, by the way, is one of only two books in the Bible that are named for women, women are the central characters. Women are held up as models of strength. And for that day and time, that's unusual. Other readers, however, they point out that this story also invites us to evaluate a social system in which women's identity, worth, and economic options are all derived from their connection, their association with a male, whether it be father, husband, or sons. Still other readers say this story isn't primarily about the role of women in society. This is really a story, another angle is, this is a story about racial prejudice. And likely, when it was first told, this story caused quite a stir among ethnocentric Hebrews, Jewish people. How could it be that deliverance should come to Naomi, a good Jewish wife and mother, through a Moabite daughter-in-law like Ruth? And so this story has all these different angles. The story of Ruth has important implications for women. It has an important a word, I think, for a world that is still wrestling and divided in so many ways by racial prejudice. But there's something else working in this story that gives it even more, I think, universal and personal appeal. And that is a story about faithfulness. It's a story about someone who found herself in a vulnerable situation and was saved by another person's faithfulness, devotion. Ruth is, I think, one of the great figures of the Bible, not because she's a woman, not because she's a Moabite. I think she's one of the great figures of Scripture because when times got hard and it would have been so much easier to bail out, Ruth refused to abandon someone with whom she had a bond. You and I are living in a time in which words like constancy, faithfulness have a haunting quality. They're almost like words from a bygone age. Who talks about fidelity anymore? It's much more popular to talk about things like self-actualization, about self-fulfillment, getting your needs met. And in our time, when putting someone else's needs before your own is sometimes ridiculed as being so old-fashioned, so unliberated, so codependent, some might even say, the story of Ruth is surprising. And maybe the story of Ruth is even offensive. After all, Ruth is a woman who elects to stay with her mother-in-law, even when it means that she herself will be giving up home and family and security for her future. You could call that an act of courage. You could call that an act of self-sacrifice. You could call it both of those things. But whatever you call it, it is Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi that saves both women in the end. Someone has said that your truest friends are individuals who Your truest friends are those people in your life who, if you are down and out, you're completely vulnerable. Maybe imagine that you're lying immobilized in a hospital bed somewhere, maybe even dying. Your truest friends are those that you would let see you in that condition. Your truest friends are the ones you would trust to see you like that, knowing that they would still love you. Just think about that. Who would you want to come to you if you were down and out? Who would you trust not to pity you or to pull away from you, but to stand by you, even if you had lost everything? Whoever comes to mind, they are the Ruths in your life. They are the Ruths of the world. And let me tell you, fashionable or not, it is the Ruths of the world who keep this world going, turning around. Ruth is the friend who walks in when everyone else walks out of your life. Ruth is the one who, as somebody has said, sings your song to you when you forget. Ruth is the one who does not shy away or flee when you're at your worst, but comes up and stands and draws alongside of you and goes with you, accompanies you down the road, not knowing where that road is necessarily even heading. Ruth is the husbands and the wives who hang in there through good and bad times, who keep giving to each other, even in seasons of imbalance, when they cannot see that they're getting much in return. Ruth is the parent who nurses a disabled child, or the adult child who cares for her own aging parents. Ruth is the one who knows how much we all need each other. Ruth is the one who believes what much of our society seems to have forgotten, that it is not so much our freedoms as it is our loyalties that give meaning to life. It's not our freedoms, but our loyalties that give meaning to life. A retired educator with decades of experience came to the conclusion that there was, as he could identify it, one single factor that determined whether or not a child would have a reasonably happy and productive adulthood. This was the factor. The child must have at least one adult who can be counted on to always be there for that child. Someone who will love her or love him no matter what. That's the factor for reasonably happy and productive adulthood. There is no substitute. Without the consistent love of at least one trustworthy adult, a child will have insecurity. A child will have a hole in their soul that's almost impossible to fill. Which leads me to think about how, as Christians, we are so blessed. Because many of us have been taught since infancy that there is a God, and that God will always love us, no matter where we go and what we do. And many of us may not have grown up with that, but we have been baptized into a community who embodied God's faithfulness to us over and over again, in the good times and in the critical times. And over the years, that faithfulness has been lived out again and again and again. Maybe it's a phone call, or I guess these days it's a text that just asks, "How are you?" Maybe it's a casserole brought when someone has died or tripped, or a baby has been born, or a death has occurred. Maybe it's a conflict that gets worked through so that even difficulties become opportunities for growth. Faithfulness, fidelity, through blood, sweat, laughter, tears. That's the glue that binds a community together. That's the glue that holds it together. Faithfulness. So, Daryl, out of all of your archives dating back to 19, yes, we know, why did you choose this one? Well, because on Tuesday, it's February 14th, and that's a good day to take a moment to honor faithfulness in all of its forms. I know so much of that day is tied up with romanticism, but it's a good day, Valentine's Day. In the context of Valentine's Day, take a moment. I encourage you this Valentine's to take a moment to honor faithfulness in all forms. Faithfulness that binds couples together into committed relationships. In the marriage relationship, that can certainly be the fullest expression of love, but also God's love, God's faithfulness. And in those sad times, when we lose loved ones through death or divorce, it will be the unswerving faithfulness of family, friends, and community that will see us through. I've conducted a number of funerals. And they're all coming back. But I have never, in the funerals I've done, I have never once heard anyone come up and they pay tribute to the person that's died. And they come up and they say, she kept a tidy house. Never heard that. I've never heard anybody come up and say about a gentleman, he put in a lot of overtime at work. Was always working hard. It's not what I hear. You've heard them. You've heard them say things like, she was there for me when I needed someone. He stood by me through thick and thin. He or she was a beloved wife, husband, mother, father, sister, brother, friend. This morning, as a faithful response to the steadfast love of God, I invite you to renew your commitments to the people you love. And I invite you to let them know with words or however you can best express it that you love them fiercely and forever. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God.